Hi, welcome to Training Talk. My name is John Cullen, and I'm your host for the weekly series here at the Institute of Police Technology and Management, as we offer you a look inside of different training tips, case studies, and some of the excellent classes we offer as we strive to train the next generation of law enforcement. At this time, I'm going to send you over to our subject matter expert who's going to share this week's weekly tip.
Hey guys, this is Carlos de Jesus. I'm one of the adjunct instructors with the Institute of Police Technology and Management. And for this video segment, we're going to be talking about a case that was worked by me along with my team here at the Broward Sheriff's Office. So in this particular case, what we have is what's a very common case for us to work as reconstructionists, which is that left turn case. And as we know, most often the question that's asked is, well, who's at fault, right? Typically, we see where the initial fault is assessed onto the person making the left-hand turn. But anyone who's done crash investigation and reconstruction for any amount of time has probably come to learn that that's not always the case. So we're actually going to be discussing that here and some of the tools that are able to be put into your toolbox by attending some of the courses here at IPTM. So this is what we've got. It's a two-vehicle crash, and it occurred about mid-afternoon. So the thing to take away from that is that lighting conditions and also weather conditions were not a factor. We've got here the two vehicles involved, a Subaru WRX and a Volkswagen Passat. The Subaru was occupied at one time, while the Volkswagen, there was a driver and front passenger. And this crash occurred because the Volkswagen turned left into the path of the Subaru. As a result of the crash, the front passenger of the Volkswagen died. Here's a layout of the intersection where this occurred. And in this particular incident, the Subaru was traveling eastbound, or from left to right on this screen. The Volkswagen was originally traveling westbound and then made the left-hand turn to go south. The intersection is controlled by a traffic control device, so there is traffic signals here. Now, here's some of the roadway evidence that we saw when we arrived on scene. Typically, our protocol is we will take a series of photographs before marking the scene, and then another series of photographs after the marks have been highlighted or painted with marking paint. The reason why we do that is to capture the evidence in its natural state and then go back and highlight the evidence to make it easier for other folks who might be looking at things who are maybe not used to identifying the physical evidence. Now, what's interesting about this is that what we want to be able to take away from all of this is how we, as crash investigators and reconstructionists, identify area of impact. And usually that's where it all begins, right? We start from where vehicles come to rest, and then we work our way back, and we just identify where everything started. Also, you got to remember that we're going to be responsible for identifying what marks belong to what vehicle. Sometimes that's easy to do. Sometimes it's not. In this case, it was kind of easy to do in the sense that the vehicle's post-crash trajectory were pretty distinct. So it was kind of easy to tell which marks led to which vehicle. But as we go through, what we saw there was gouging, scrapes, tire marks, right? All of these things tell us not only AOC or area of collision, but then also path of travel post-crash. We also start to look at some of the evidence on the vehicle that tells us what it may have made contact with as it came to rest. We start to identify the damage profiles, contact damage versus induced damage. Now we're following the path of the Volkswagen. And again, some distinct evidence there consistent with the fact that the vehicle was at some point put onto its roof and sliding to final rest. So with that, we have to understand that not only is there roadway evidence, but then there's also going to be some vehicle evidence that is going to be important. Tells us a lot about the movement of the vehicle as it slid to final rest. Here we see that what we're identifying is that initial area of contact between the two vehicles. That's also extremely important because for those of us who've worked these types of crashes, we know that ultimately we're going to be doing a conservation of linear momentum analysis and orientation of the two vehicles as it relates to each other at the point of impact becomes an important thing to identify. So at this point, we're noticing, again, that initial point of contact between the two vehicles. In this case, it was to the front passenger side of the Volkswagen. This segment here is going to show just a little bit of how our case flow goes in regards to how we put things together and how we prepare to be able to do that conservation of linear momentum analysis. So here we started off with a Google Earth representation of that intersection. And what you see there is now that area having been traced with a drawing program. And there actually is quite a good span of distance there covered. Some of you may have noticed in the photographs, there was a Faro scanner in some of the shots. And this is what was produced from those scans. So what we see here, again, is that 3D representation from a bird's eye view. And we can identify here the two vehicles at final rest. And if we look closely, for those of us who are used to looking at this type of evidence, we can even identify some of the post-crash roadway marks leading to final rest of the two vehicles. Here, what you see is we've gone ahead and we've put those two components together so that now we have a 2-scale representation of specifically where the crash occurred, along with that, the rest of that span. Because again, if we've done this before, we know that along with that conservation of linear momentum analysis, at some point we might be looking at time distance. We're going to be trying to answer some questions about crash avoidance and gap acceptance. Here we see a close-up of that representation, the two vehicles at first touch, along with the roadway evidence identified for each of them, and final rest locations. So with this, we're going to be using this to identify our post-collision trajectories, and that'll give us our post-crash angles. When we completed our conservation of linear momentum analysis, and again, this is what we call that the pen and paper math, right? This isn't us using systems or anything like that. This is us just kind of trying to figure out what speeds we've got. We haven't gotten into an event data recorder or anything like that yet. We're just looking at what the physical evidence tells us and what we're able, or how we're able to interpret that evidence. And these were the angles and the weights that were used based on our research of the vehicles, along with identification of the roadway evidence. And ultimately what we came up with was that the impact speed of the Subaru was just under 80 miles an hour, 79 miles an hour. And the Volkswagen was at about 12 miles an hour. Now, as an instructor, this is a point where I like to remind the students to always slow down for a moment and stop and think, does it make sense? Right? And overall, at this point, I would say, yes, it does make sense. Right? We see that there was a good amount of damage to the Subaru, as well as the Volkswagen. We see that the Volkswagen was redirected, not 100%, but pretty much into the original trajectory or the original inbound angle of the Subaru. We know that that takes a good amount of energy. So everything is starting to make sense with that 79. And then when we look at the 12 miles an hour for the turning speed of the Volkswagen, again, that's something that also makes sense. If we go out and we look at vehicles coming off of a stop or even a slow roll, we'll see that that's usually that's not a completely inconsistent speed. Something I didn't mention is that the driver of this vehicle was on the elderly side. So we know that elderly drivers tend to drive a little more cautiously, a little more slowly than, say, someone else that may be a little bit younger, and may have taken that same turn at, say, maybe 15 or even 20. Again, not inconsistent for what we're looking at. What you see here off to the right-hand side of the screen is just based on these numbers, based on this conservation of linear momentum analysis, we calculated a delta V for the Subaru to be somewhere in the area of about 50. You could even round that up to 51 if you wanted to, with a PDOF of negative 8.8. So if you want to look at that, around 8 or 9 degrees. And remember the negative when we're talking about principal direction of force. All that's going to tell us is that it's going to be to the left of center in this case. The big takeaway here is that we see that this is a big crash, right? That 50, 51 mile per hour delta V tells us this is a big crash, which is extremely consistent with what we've seen. So now we go ahead and we take a look at the event data recorder. So just to recap really quick, in case maybe you haven't worked these types of cases, keep in mind that the conservation of linear momentum, we may have used some type of a computer program to do it. We tend not to. My team, we tend to do everything by hand typically, and then because our handwriting is not the best, we will go ahead and at that point we'll use a computer system just for presentation, or maybe we'll type it out for presentation's sake. But we're generally speaking, we're pretty old school in the sense that the initial run for the math is done by hand. We'll start employing systems typically when we're trying to look at sensitivity to angles and things like that, because at that point it makes it easier to just punch in numbers and get a quick response to what types of effects changes in angles might have. But the point of that is that it's just us looking at the physical evidence, coming up, or not, I shouldn't say coming up with, but using the physical evidence to determine what those inbound and outbound angles are, using the outbound distances along with a solid interpretation of the physical evidence to give us ideas of what the F values, the coefficient of friction values are, so that we can confidently calculate those post-crash speeds. We got to remember that all of those variables are extremely important when we're doing a conservation of linear momentum analysis, because the more confident we are of those variables, and the more confident we can be in our calculations. But now we're switching over to event data recorder, which, if you're familiar with this, is what a lot of folks call the black box on the vehicle. But it's or typically it's the airbag control module within the vehicle. And we know that the event data recorder does just that. It records certain information pertinent to the crash that the vehicle was involved in, which we can then use in our analysis. So let's go ahead and take a look at what our analysis of the event data recorder shows us regarding this crash. In this particular crash, the only vehicle that was supported was the Subaru. The Volkswagen was not. But good for us that the Subaru is really our vehicle of interest. It's the vehicle that we're up to now. All the evidence is telling us was the one speeding and potentially, at the very least, contributory, if not at fault for this crash. So one of the things that we start to do as analysts of the event data recorder information is the first thing we want to do is we want to feel confident that we can associate the event that was recorded to our crash. So there's going to be certain things that we're going to look at to see whether or not that's the case. In this particular report, we see at the very top line their ignition cycle at download, which means when I downloaded the information from the event data recorder, it counted 3,203 key cycles. We see it just a little bit further down in that second area there that the ignition cycle at crash was recorded at 3,202. That's a very good sign for us, because what that means is that there was only one key cycle added to the event data recorder from the time the crash occurred to when this download was completed. If we're familiar with this process of downloading information, we know that for most manufacturers, when we introduce power to the event data recorder to download the information, it considers that an additional key cycle. So basically what this is showing is that plus one is just that. It's just us having introduced power to the event data recorder so that we can download the information. We also see that the file recording was complete. That becomes important too, because that tends to indicate that there is no spoilage of information. We see there that there was only one event on there as well. Now, what I have circled there in red is that the maximum delta V, the maximum change in velocity that's being recorded here on the longitudinal sense of the vehicle, or from front to rear, is a negative 51.6, which simply means that it was slowed down by approximately that amount. If you guys remember, just a few slides ago, our delta V calculated from our conservation of linear momentum analysis, we got about 50.8, which I said, if you really wanted to, you could kind of round that up to 51. Well, what we're starting to see here is where our conservation of linear momentum analysis is already starting to line up very nicely with the information contained within the event data recorder report. What we're seeing here is just a graph representing the change in velocity on the longitudinal sense. We know from training that your average crash pulse is approximately 100 to 150 milliseconds. And that's what I've got highlighted there within that box, is that time frame. And what we're looking for is to see at what point that graph, that line plateaus, right? You see there's a downward slope as the crash pulse increases, and then at some point it levels out. And that's really what we're looking for. And in this particular case, it does just that within that average crash pulse time. When we look at the lateral sense of the vehicle, so side to side, we see the same thing, that within that 100 to 150 millisecond time frame, we see that the delta V tend to plateau. In this particular case, the primary axis of this for the collision itself, the primary axis is the longitudinal axis of the vehicle. So that's the one that we're going to be using as the benchmark for kind of fine tuning what our delta V's are going to be for the calculations. And you'll see that here in a moment. These two charts here, they do not display in this way side by side like this in the actual report. So there is some cutting that I've done for this presentation, and those are for those of you who maybe are not familiar with working with event data recorders. But what I'm showing here is that when we look at these two side by side, this is just a chart representing the graphs that we just looked at. And when we look at these side by side, we see that within that time frame of 100 to 150 milliseconds, we see that right around 120 milliseconds based on the longitudinal axis. Again, that's our primary, so that's the one that I'm going to be looking at first. That's where we see that there is no longer any change, or the first point in this crash pulse where we see no more than a half a mile an hour of change for every 20 milliseconds of time. So once I've identified that, now 51.0, which is slightly different than the maximum that we saw. If memory serves, it was 51.6. Actually, no, it might have been that same 51. Yep. In this case, it is that 51. And then we see in correspondence to that at the 120 milliseconds, we see 7.5 on the lateral. So now these two numbers are going to go into a couple of calculations that we're going to do. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to use those two numbers, the delta V on the x-axis or the longitudinal axis, and on the lateral axis, and we're going to combine those to get a total delta V. And we see here that we get 51.54 or 51.5. If you want to just truncate it there. And then we also, where you off to the right there, where you see that 46 to 56, that is because training and research, well, primarily research, and then the training that's been passed on to us as analysts for the event data recorder is that the sensors, the delta V sensors, are accurate within plus or minus 10%. So what I'm doing there is I'm applying that 10% to the 51 and the plus or minus 10%. And that's where we see now that 46 to 56 range. Now, when we use those same two numbers, the longitudinal delta V and the lateral delta V, we can also use that information to calculate the principal direction of force. And we see that we get a negative approximately 8 degrees, again, just left of center to the front. And as we continue down this slide here, as a reminder, these charts down here at the bottom, where we have delta V of the X vehicle and PDOF acting on the X vehicle, that is what we got from our conservation of linear momentum analysis. Now, the reason why that's important is because, again, the idea here of what we're trying to accomplish is, number one, we've determined that the recording on the event data recorder is related to our event. There were certain things that we looked at that said, yep, it's our event. But now the next prong there is, well, should we be relying on the information contained within the report? And what this has done is it's allowed us to do a checks and balance and say, well, okay, my independent conservation of linear momentum analysis, which is based on my interpretation of the evidence, and hopefully you guys caught that evidence, that emphasis, it's interpretation of the physical evidence, has allowed me to say, okay, well, here are my speeds, and based on those speeds, here's my change in velocity, and here's my PDOF, my principal direction of force. Now we're looking at the instrumentation within the vehicle, which has been deemed to be very reliable and accurate. And here we are being able to look at those two things side by side and say, okay, my conservation of linear momentum gives me one answer, and look at this. The onboard systems are pretty much telling me the exact same thing. All right. And I should be careful with that word exact, because obviously they're not the exact same numbers, but hopefully you guys understand what I'm trying to say. They're definitely consistent with each other. As we continue through the event data recorder, we see here now another section of the report referred to as the pre-crash data. And this is really where, for anyone who's worked with this type of information, this is where your reconstruction, in my opinion, just really comes to life. When we look at this pre-crash data, we start to see a little bit more of what I like to call the attitude of the driver, because what we're getting a glimpse into is an approximate 5-second window prior to the crash. I'm sure it's happened to you guys at some point if you've worked enough cases where you will do a conservation of linear momentum analysis and your impact speeds are close to or within a reasonable amount over the speed limit, the posted speed limit. And at that point, you're left with, well, is there more to this or not? Did speed play a factor or not? And more often than not, it's difficult to say, because again, when all the information we have tells us that the impact speed is at or about the posted speed limit, there's nothing in the physical evidence that tell us there was pre-impact slowing down or anything like that. Well, then it becomes difficult for us to say that, oh yeah, they were speeding prior to the crash and that contributed to this event. But with the event data recorder giving us that 5-second window, that speculation is gone. We're now able to see, okay, what was going on prior to that. Now, specifically with this event, we see here that there are some high speeds involved. We see that at about 5 seconds prior to the crash itself, this individual was traveling at about 106 miles an hour, which is already well above the posted speed limit. I hadn't mentioned it up to this point, but I don't think it takes a much leap there for anyone to understand that there are no roads in South Florida where the speed limit is anywhere near 100 miles an hour. In this particular area, it was actually 45. So we see here that this individual is already more than 2 times the speed limit. But more interestingly, as we look at this, as we start to we get to start to see that picture of what's going on prior to, and I'll say it, what I like to call the attitude of the driver. Specifically, when we look at the accelerator pedal percentage, that is actually, how much the input of the driver on the pedal itself. And we see that it's at 100%. What this tells me is the driver is already doing, at about 5 seconds prior to the impact, he's already doing more than twice the speed limit, and that's just not enough for him. He's trying to get more, right? And we see that his car achieves that. It continues to accelerate up to about 115 miles an hour, approximately 2.5 seconds before the impact. Now we see that things changed, right? We see that things have changed. It went from him being 100% on the gas to pretty much off the gas and onto the brake. And he starts to slow down to about 80 miles an hour at impact. As a quick reminder, a few moments ago, I showed you guys where when we did our conservation of linear momentum, we calculated that the impact speed was 79. So again, we're seeing a very, very good tie-in between the interpretation of the physical evidence and what the event data recorder is telling us in regards to speeds at impact, the delta V's, the changes in velocity that the vehicle experienced, and the principal direction of force introduced to the vehicle. All of this stuff is coming together very nicely. Also, towards the end of this chart, or towards the bottom of the chart, I show here where there's some steering input. It was determined that all of this made sense with the physical evidence because we have the individual traveling originally in the inside lane, which would be the lane closest to the median, but then impact occurred in line with, if memory serves, it was either the center or even the right hand lane. So that tells us that there was some change in direction from his original, from where he was originally traveling. So now let's go ahead and take a look at some other information that we're able to get using this event data recorder report. What you're looking at here is a speed at impact based on the pre-crash information. And if you've worked with this before, this should be very familiar to you. If you haven't, well, then we're going to talk very shortly here about how you can become familiar with this information. But basically what we're doing here is we're doing just another analysis based on the speed at impact, because we know that there are certain things that can affect the accuracy of the speedometer or the speed being fed to the event data recorder. So we see here that the last data sample that we got was that the vehicle was moving at about 80 miles per hour. But we know that, as I pointed out to you guys, he was on the brakes. The driver was on the brakes leading up to that point where it recorded 80 miles per hour. And using the information that we see in the event data recorder, we're able to calculate that the effective drag factor was about a 0.677. Maybe you can round it up to a 0.68 if you'd like to. Not much of a difference there. And then we basically calculate a speed change for the possibility of another half second of information. The reason why we do that is, again, discussed in our training when we talk about using event data recorder and traffic crash reconstruction. But It basically is the idea that because the information is not reported synchronously, there is a potential for another half second or whatever the time frames are recorded. In this particular event data recorder, it was half second increments. So we applied the potential of another half second of slowing down, which equates to about 7 miles an hour. Now, when we look at slip, specifically what that's referring to is whether or not ABS was engaged. When we look at this particular report, there might be some that say, yeah, ABS was engaged. Another reconstructionist may say, no, I don't think it was. So what I did here was I said, okay, well, let's go ahead and take a look at both scenarios. And we're able to do that in this case by just what column we put things into, because it's both, in this particular case, it would be plus 5% for both columns. So what I said was, for my min column, I said, well, we're going to say that ABS was not engaged and therefore no need to add it in. And then on the max side, I said, well, yes, ABS was engaged, and we went ahead and added that 5% in. The 5% that we're talking about is 5% of that last data sample speed, the 80 miles per hour. Speedometer error, you're always going to have plus or minus 4%. So that's what you're seeing there. And now what that gives us is a speed range of 69 to 87. And again, the only reason why we're doing this is to look at the reliability of the information. Again, we're looking at, is it related and is it reliable? Can I use this information that's contained within the event data recorder for any additional analyses? In this particular case, since everything is falling within the ranges, we have determined that yes, we can. Our conservation of linear momentum speed was 79, which falls within that range. So again, we're looking at what our independent interpretation of the evidence tells us and what speeds we calculated from that as compared to what the onboard systems of the vehicle is telling us the speed range was. So since we have determined that, yes, the information can be relied upon, we've gone ahead and done just that. We've gone ahead and said, okay, we're going to use this information for additional analyses. And now we're going to start looking into crash avoidance and gap acceptance. And excuse me, because when we look at these, we look at them the other way around, or at least I do. I look at them as gap acceptance first and then crash avoidance. And we'll explain here momentarily. What you're seeing here is a time distance chart based on the EDR. We see here the speeds that were recorded at each of the time frames. I've converted those miles per hour over to feet per second. And then I'm basically taking the average for each segment from that span of time between each sample, and then getting a cumulative distance in that last column. So now what I'm able to do is just say, okay, well, at any given time, I'm able to tell you approximately how many feet away, in this case, the Subaru was from the collision. When we talk about gap acceptance, really, this is the question we're answering. It's, do I have time to turn? This idea comes from the understanding, and I'm sure maybe you guys have thought about it as you're driving around, maybe not. But I'm sure you can acknowledge that anytime you're preparing to make a left-hand turn, really and you're looking at oncoming traffic before you do so, hopefully, the idea that, the whole idea that you're trying to accomplish there is, well, do I have enough time to do this? Do I have enough time to get across these lanes without getting hit? So that is what all drivers are looking at, hopefully, is to try to answer this question. Very rarely, unless maybe you are a cop, do we look at oncoming traffic and go, oh, well, that individual is traveling at 55 miles an hour in a 45. I'm not going to turn. That's not the way we process things. All we're doing is we're looking down the road and saying, yeah, it appears that vehicle is far enough away that I should have enough time to complete what I'm trying to do here. So we're going to see how that plays into things here momentarily. based on our conservation of linear momentum analysis, we had determined that the Volkswagen was at or about 12 miles an hour when it was struck. We determined that from the stop bar to the area of collision, it's approximately 78 feet. As you can see here, at 12 miles per hour, when we convert that to a unit of feet per second, it's approximately 18. So now what we're able to do is say, okay, well, how much time would it take to get from the stop bar to area of collision, or to cover that span of 78 feet? So we looked at this in two different ways. We said, well, if it had just rolled through, then it would have taken approximately 4.5 seconds. If the vehicle had stopped and then proceeded up to that speed, it would have taken approximately 4.6. And what we see here is that at about 4.5 seconds, what you're seeing in the upper right-hand corner is a snip or a snapshot from the time distance of the Subaru. And we're seeing that at that 4.5 seconds, the Subaru was approximately 679 feet away. So what that means is that when the driver of the Volkswagen was looking down the road and said, okay, I'm good to turn, it was about 4.5 seconds prior to the impact. Now we take the posted speed limit of 45, and if the Subaru had been traveling at that posted speed, well, then it would have only been covering about 66 feet per second. So now when we say, okay, well, at 66 feet per second, how much time would it take to cover those 679 feet? We see that it's a little over 10 seconds, right? Because again, as a driver, as your average driver, they're not looking at time. They're not looking at distance per se. They're looking at time. Do I have enough time? So this is where that idea of gap acceptance comes in. There is research done, right, where 100% of drivers would have accepted that time or distance gap. Right? Think about it. 10 seconds to make a left-hand turn. Just about anybody would say, yeah, I've got more than enough time to do what I need to do and be out of the way of any oncoming vehicles. And that is simply because average drivers not necessarily judging speed. They're just looking at the distance of the vehicle, the approaching vehicle, and translating that into how much time they would have based on the assumption that everyone's traveling at or about the posted speed limit. So now we look at crash avoidance. And I'm sorry, to just go back for a moment with the idea of gap acceptance, what we're doing there is we're saying, well, is there any, I don't want to necessarily use the word liability, but was there any thought of that maybe this driver chose to turn when they shouldn't have, right? And again, that the research has shown that 100% of those drivers studied or observed would have considered 10 seconds to be plenty of time. So we can start to say, okay, this didn't happen because the turning driver did not correctly evaluate the situation. Now, when we look at crash avoidance, now we're looking at a slightly different aspect of the reconstruction, and it's, well, what did the driver of the Subaru do? And we have to be careful with what we change and when we do these what if scenarios, because anyone who's been doing this long enough knows that if we change any one thing, the crash doesn't tend to happen, because that's the way life works, right? The crash happened because there was specific things that occurred in sequence leading up to the crash. But what we're looking at here specifically is looking at the response that the driver of the Subaru had to see how, if at all, it played into things or if things could have been different. So what we're looking at here specifically is, in this case, we know the driver of the Subaru applied the brakes. We see that from the event data recorder. And we see that happened about 2 seconds before the crash. So what we did here was we said, okay, well, at that, we'll say that the driver of the Subaru was going down the road at that 45 mile an hour. And at 2 seconds before the crash said, I need to stop this vehicle. Again, trying to keep things as static as we can, because the more variables we change, then obviously the further away we get from what actually happened. So looking at the scenario of 2 seconds before impact at the speed limit, could he have stopped in time to avoid the crash? So we see here that at about 2 seconds, the Subaru was approximately 267 feet away. And we're going to use that same deceleration factor that we had already calculated based on the event data recorder. Again, one of the beauties of understanding that information is sometimes our coefficient of friction or deceleration factors tend to be maybe from a drag sled or a Vericom or a V-box or some type of instrumentation maybe. But there's always that question of like, well, how close to the actual deceleration factor am I getting? Well, here it's, again, that 0.67 that I have there on the screen is coming from the event data recorder. It's what the vehicle what was reported to have achieved. So applying that deceleration factor with the speeds of 45 miles an hour, we see that it would have only taken approximately 100 feet to stop, giving him plenty of time to avoid, or distance, to avoid this collision. Even at 55, same thing. It would have taken approximately 150 feet to stop, still over 100 feet to avoid the collision. Even at 65 miles an hour, and could still have avoided the collision by approximately 57 feet. So we see that what this is telling us is that the driver's speed, the fact that they were going so much over the posted speed limit, is a direct factor or direct contribution or even cause of this collision. Because again, we looked at the gap acceptance. 100% of drivers would have said, I've got plenty of time to make this turn. And now we look at the flip side of that of, okay, well, based on this information, could the crash have been avoided if this driver had been doing the posted speed limit? And the answer is yes. So at the close of this presentation, what we'd like to do is, again, I've kind of mentioned it throughout. If you've seen this before, if you've done it, then maybe you've gotten something new, maybe you haven't. But for those of you who are still maybe new into this or just haven't worked that many cases with it, and you just haven't put it all to use, we highly recommend that you take a look at IPTM's training schedule. Just as you can see here, are listed the different courses that allowed us, my team, to put this crash together, put this reconstruction together. I've mentioned it several times throughout this presentation. Your conservation of linear momentum analysis is largely based on your ability to properly identify the physical evidence. That is always going to be the most important thing you can do, is the best of your ability, identify the physical evidence from any pre-crash roadway evidence to the crash and post-crash. All of that stuff makes a difference. As I mentioned before, it's going to help you to be able to designate your inbound and outbound angles, as well as best as possible, what is your effective drag factor for the post-crash movement, right? Because that is going to allow you to come up with some of the variables, which is your post-crash speed. So hopefully you guys are starting to understand here, for those who haven't worked with this before, if your post-crash speeds are off, your at speed or your impact speeds are going to be off. If your angles are off, your impact speeds are going to be off, right? So all of this stuff matters, and then proper interpretation of the physical evidence matters. So your at scene traffic crash or traffic homicide investigation course, along with the advanced traffic crash reconstruction and your traffic crash reconstructions levels 1 and 2, take care of that. They really give you a good sense of what the physical evidence is and how to interpret that physical evidence, right? Advanced traffic crash reconstruction is where we really dive into time distance. So if that's ever been a source of contention for you, hopefully attending that course will definitely help to gain a better understanding. Your traffic crash reconstruction levels 1 and 2 is where we dive heavily into conservation of linear momentum and how to use that method to calculate your impact speeds. Your at-scene traffic crash, traffic homicide investigations gives you a very good opportunity to learn or to better understand the physical evidence and the interpretation of. We also saw that we dived into the event data recorder. So if that's something that maybe you have not had an opportunity to really put to use yet, we highly encourage you to check out the event data recorder use in traffic crash reconstructions, both levels 1 and 2. Great source of information on how to use this, how to interpret the information, and how to incorporate it with your reconstructions. Also, we talked about human factors in traffic crash reconstruction. When we talked about gap acceptance and crash avoidance, those are 2 ideas straight out of that course as well, human factors in traffic crash reconstruction. So you can see here that there's, without even going into the idea of what to photograph or how to photograph it or any of those things, which there are courses that are offered by IPTM on that topic as well. Without even going into that, there's already 5 courses here that we highly recommend you check out, which we believe will definitely give you a much better understanding on how to use this physical evidence to achieve the goal of coming down to answering that question, right? Again, we started off here with a question. Well, whose fault is this crash? And I think we've been able to determine that. So with nothing else, guys, I hope this was a good experience for you and look forward to seeing you guys on the next one.
Thanks for watching this week's Training Talk Tip. We hope that you found this beneficial as you move forward in your investigations. Please be sure to comment if there's any future Training Talk tips that we could bring to you or areas of interest. And while doing so, we'd like you to follow us on all of our social media channels so that you can stay in tune with the latest training. While doing so, also check us out at IPTM.org, where we have a large catalog of courses that are offered throughout the country. And if there's not one nearby, perhaps reach out to us and we could bring the training to you. Again, we hope that you follow along, found this useful, and we look forward to seeing you next week.